It was a quiet morning in the suburbs when one cop made a huge mistake. He thought he could bully an old woman into handing over her groceries, never imagining the storm he was about to unleash. To the world, she was just another elderly lady out for a simple errand. But what this officer didn't know was that her son was no ordinary man. He wasn't just anyone you'd meet on the street. He was a top-tier Delta Force commander, known for his tactical genius and unmatched skill in any combat situation. As the officer tried to intimidate the woman, thinking she was an easy target, he had no idea that his actions would soon have serious consequences. This wasn't just about an old woman and her groceries. It was about waking up a sleeping giant. The son, a highly trained elite soldier, had made it clear: no one messes with his family. Now, the cop was in for a rude awakening. What was meant to be a simple act of intimidation was quickly turning into a nightmare that he never saw coming. How will the officer deal with the terrifying truth of who he just targeted? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The old woman, Mrs. Carter, had seen more than her fair share of tough times. Her husband, a former military man, passed away years ago, and her son Jack had been away on special assignments for most of her life. She learned to manage on her own, staying independent and strong, but there was always a part of her that hoped Jack would return home one day. She never asked for much, just some peace and quiet in her later years. Little did she know that peace was about to be shattered. As the officer's voice grew louder, Mrs. Carter stood her ground, holding onto her bag like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She had seen enough violence in her life to recognize a threat when it came. But this wasn't just any random officer. He had been known for his aggressive tactics in the neighborhood. That morning, something inside her snapped. She wasn't afraid of him, but she knew that the situation was about to escalate. Across the city, Jack had just returned from a covert mission that had kept him off the radar for months. He had been looking forward to catching up with his mother, but he had no idea that she was facing a much darker situation than he could have ever imagined. As Mrs. Carter silently made a call, her fingers trembling, she knew that help wasn't just a phone call away. It was the kind of help only a Delta Force commander could provide. As the officer stood there, his smug expression never wavering, he failed to notice the subtle shift in Mrs. Carter's demeanor. The old woman's hand moved to her phone, almost unnoticed, as if her actions were casual, but her mind was anything but calm. She had learned in her younger years that sometimes the quietest people were the most dangerous, and her son had made sure she was never truly defenseless. Meanwhile, across town, Jack was settling into his apartment, unaware that the quiet morning he hoped for would soon turn into a nightmare. He had just finished unpacking his gear when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen made his blood run cold: his mother. He hadn't heard from her in weeks, and he immediately sensed something was wrong. "Jack, it's happening again." Her voice crackled through the line, shaking with barely contained fear. "I need you now." Jack's pulse quickened. He didn't need to ask what she meant. The officer, the one who had harassed her before, was back. The one who'd bullied her in the past for simply existing in a neighborhood he thought she didn't belong to. But this time, something had gone too far. Before he even thought, Jack was out the door, driving through the streets at a speed that only someone with his training could maintain. In his mind, every second mattered. He wasn't just going to stop an officer. He was going to make a point. The cop had no idea what kind of storm was about to hit him. But Jack wasn't thinking about consequences. He was thinking about his mother, who was, for all intents and purposes, alone in the face of danger. Back at the scene, the officer was beginning to realize something wasn't quite right. Mrs. Carter's calm, almost eerie, silence had started to unsettle him. Her old face was still, her eyes sharp as ever. The bag she gripped so tightly now felt like it held a secret, one the officer had no hope of uncovering. The tension between them grew thicker with each passing second. The officer's hand twitched, ready to reach for his baton, but he hesitated. Something about her didn't fit the picture he had of a frail, defenseless old woman. A sudden, unsettling thought struck him. Could she be waiting for something or someone? The officer's eyes flickered down to the bag Mrs. Carter was holding, and for the first time, he wondered if there was more to this elderly woman than he'd realized. His pulse quickened, but his arrogance was stronger. He was the law. He'd handled far worse than a fragile old woman. But then again, this felt different. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as Mrs. Carter's gaze never wavered. She seemed almost expectant, like a calm before a storm. His instincts were telling him something was off, but his pride refused to let him back down. With a sharp breath, he took a step forward, his hand moving toward his holster. "Give me the bag," he demanded again, his voice rougher this time. Mrs. Carter didn't respond. Instead, she pressed a single button on her phone and slipped it back into her purse. The air seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, there was no noise, no cars, no voices, just the tense, crackling silence that stretched between them. Down the road, Jack was already close, his car a blur through the streets. His thoughts raced, but his hands were steady on the wheel. He wasn't just angry, he was calm, like he always was before a mission. He could already feel the danger creeping closer, the threat building with each passing second. He wasn't about to let his mother face this alone. His mind sharpened as he planned his approach, calculating how he'd handle the situation. Back at the scene, the officer's patience was running thin. He took another step, his hand finally wrapping around the handle of his baton. The quiet woman before him had pushed him too far, and something about her was starting to make him nervous. He looked around, as if waiting for backup, but the street was empty. And then, just as the tension reached a breaking point, a sound broke through the silence. A car's engine roared in the distance, growing louder by the second. It wasn't just any car, it was a sleek, dark vehicle, speeding toward them like a force of nature. The officer froze, the baton halfway to his side, his eyes darting to the approaching car. His instinct told him to act, but it was too late. Jack's car screeched to a halt just a few feet away, and for the first time, the officer felt the weight of a presence he hadn't anticipated. Jack stepped out, his face calm, but his eyes burning with a purpose the officer hadn't seen before. "Step away from my mother." Jack's voice was low, controlled, yet it carried a weight that sent a chill down the officer's spine. The officer's hand instinctively went to his radio, his fingers trembling slightly as he struggled to make sense of what was unfolding. Jack's presence was like a force he couldn't ignore, and something in the air had shifted. The tension that had built between him and Mrs. Carter was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of the moment now. Jack's stare was unwavering, his body language tense but controlled, a soldier's focus evident in every movement. For a second, the officer hesitated. His training told him to handle the situation by the book, call for backup, de-escalate, follow procedure. But nothing in this situation followed the book. Something about Jack's composed demeanor made the officer question everything he thought he knew. The cold, calculated look in Jack's eyes was enough to make him reconsider his next move, but pride and perhaps fear held him in place. Just as Jack took another step forward, a sudden voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here, officer?" The words weren't directed at Jack, but at the officer. The voice came from behind, smooth and confident, a tone that made the officer's heart skip. He turned just in time to see a second figure emerging from the shadows, a tall man in a dark suit, his face sharp and businesslike. The officer's instincts flared. This wasn't just a bystander. This was someone important. His pulse quickened again, but his voice came out hoarse. "What's this about? I'm handling this." The man in the suit took a deliberate step forward, his eyes briefly meeting Jack's before settling on the officer. "I think you've handled enough," the man said coldly. "You've overstepped." The officer frowned, his mind racing. This wasn't just some stranger. It was the same man he'd seen once before in a confidential briefing. A government agent, someone far higher up the chain than he was. The moment the officer recognized him, his body tensed in alarm. Something was deeply wrong, and he had just walked into a web he wasn't equipped to untangle. Jack barely moved, his expression still calm. But behind that stillness, something dangerous simmered. He knew the man in the suit too, though they weren't on friendly terms. This was not just an ordinary officer causing trouble. The situation had spiraled far beyond a petty confrontation. And now, with this mysterious government agent involved, everything was about to change. As the officer began to process the sudden shift in power dynamics, his fingers tightened around the baton, but his heart had already begun to race. The stakes had just gone from personal to something much larger, and Jack was ready to play the game at a level the officer couldn't even comprehend. The tension hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. The officer, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, was caught between two powerful forces: Jack, a highly trained Delta Force commander, and the mysterious government agent who seemed to hold all the cards. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, but his pride wouldn't allow it. He wasn't going to let this slip. Jack, however, was a man of action, and his patience had run thin. He took another step forward, his eyes locked on the officer. "Step away from my mother, now," he repeated, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored. The officer's hand tightened on his baton, but he didn't move. Before the officer could make another move, the man in the suit spoke again, his voice colder now. "I think it's time we end this." Without warning, the agent stepped forward, and in a swift motion, he grabbed the officer's radio from his belt and smashed it under his boot. The officer stumbled back, confused and disoriented, unable to process what had just happened. Then, as if everything had been orchestrated, Jack moved. In a flash, he had the officer pinned against the side of the car, his arm twisted behind him in a hold so precise it was over before the officer could even fight back. "Not another step," Jack warned the agent, his voice low and dangerous. The officer grunted in pain, but was powerless to break free. The agent raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed but unfazed. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice laced with amusement. "You're not the only one with power here. You've just made things more complicated for yourself." But before Jack could respond, a sudden, loud crash echoed through the street. A black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb, and from it stepped several armed men in tactical gear, more than just government agents. These were professionals, and they weren't here to negotiate. The agent's face shifted, his cool demeanor cracking for the first time. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice now laced with panic. One of the new arrivals, a tall woman with a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward. "We're here to clean up your mess." She glanced at Jack, who hadn't moved an inch, still holding the officer with a deadly grip. "Is it done?" Jack nodded. "It's over." The woman turned to the officer, who was now breathing heavily. "You've crossed the line," she said with an edge of finality, "and now you'll answer for it." Just when the officer thought things couldn't get worse, Jack leaned in close, his voice quiet but piercing. "You should have stayed away from my family. You don't know who you're dealing with." As the woman gave a sharp nod, signaling the end of the officer's involvement, Jack's attention shifted back to the agent. The final twist came when the agent reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, sleek device. "You may have won this round, Jack," he said, his eyes gleaming with a hidden agenda. "But you just unleashed something much bigger than you realize." Before anyone could react, the agent hit a button, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. It wasn't just the officer or the agent that was a threat. It was a much larger network, one Jack had never anticipated, now moving to secure its hold.